Hello and welcome. Today I've decided to come out of internet obscurity to talk about one of my all-time favourite games, Journey. Recently I came across a review of the game made by the talented YouTuber known as Kadikarus, who critically panned the game for its frustrating ambiguity, lack of worthwhile content, and for allegedly having no replayability. After discovering an almost entirely negative review of the game, I felt drawn to revisit other reviews I'd seen, as well as to contemplate how I could organise and justify my own thoughts about it. The material for this video discussion was compiled from notes on the said review by Kadikarus and from the exceptionally clever comparison video between Journey and Dear Esther by the talented YouTuber Matthew Matosis. Before I start, I'd like to make it clear that I have nothing against Kadikarus or his opinion, which is in itself perfectly justified and as subjective as anyone else's, which he freely admits in his video. That being said, the content of this video will largely consist of breaking down the criticisms made by Kadikarus, analysing them and considering which of them hold merit and which are wholly shaped by his own particular experience of the game. I will also be referring to a lot of Matthew Matosis' points from his video to help formulate counter-arguments. So without further delay, let's get right into it. Journey was released in 2012 by indie developers That Game Company for a price mark of around $15. Their previous installments include Flow and Flower, which are both critically acclaimed for their intuitive simplicity. That Game Company's core values have always highly prioritised emotional engagement and accessibility for the player, regarding a simplistic, immersive experience as more ideal than something which challenges the player with dexterous game mechanics. With this tact in mind, many would argue that the games they make are not for everyone, that they are created for the sake of their own artistic merit than for any particular audience. As Kadikarus argues, making games in this way is a risk from a player standpoint, since not every player will respond to the content of the game positively. Although this view has some sense to it, I believe there is plenty about That Game Company's titles which hold universal appeal, and this can surely be said in the case of Journey. As Matthew Matosis points out, Journey relies on nothing but itself to convey its themes, probably crossing every cultural barrier there is. Since the game relies on a purely aesthetic language to communicate to the player, transcending all language barriers, it appeals to an exceptionally broad audience. To put it simply, anyone gifted with the power of sight and with 2 remaining limbs can play and enjoy Journey, no matter what their cultural background. As previously mentioned, That Game Company's titles have a lack of deep game mechanics and are minimalistic and simplistic by their very nature. Frustratingly for Kadikarus, it seems his expectations of what he considers to be a video game did not match with his experience of Journey. To put it in other words, what you actually do in the game did not very much appeal to him, and this is perfectly understandable. However, I believe that in order to be a video game, a title needs to be interactive. Kadikarus accuses Journey as failing as an interactive medium, which prompted me to question, is Journey not interactive then? The answer to this, although obvious, may not satisfy everyone, but the reality is this. The story, or experience of Journey, will not progress unless you, the player, interact with it. Likewise, people you meet online are unlikely to cooperate unless you attempt to communicate or interact with them in some way. Similarly, the end result of the game cannot be reached unless the player goes out and decides to attain it. Despite the obvious fact that Journey indeed is an interactive experience, Kadikarus insists that for him not enough is going on plot or gameplay wise to keep him emotionally invested. And to that I say, fair enough. But if we look a little deeper into what might constitute an enjoyable plot or set of game mechanics, then we start to have our disagreements. So let's take a look at the actual plot of Journey before deciding whether this element of the game is even relevant or necessary when considering the factors that have made it into a success. One question we might ask ourselves in this situation is, do games even need plot in order to be successful? A game like Pac-Man, for instance, has no real plot, but is enjoyed the world over. Granted, this is an arcade game loved worldwide for being fun to play. People play the game for the sake of it, and there's not very much else to it. The same could be said of Journey. Several people enjoy the game for the extraordinary freedom of movement available to the player. In many cases, the sense of flying and gliding about a visually astounding environment to a breathtakingly beautiful soundtrack is appealing in itself. However, if we are going to consider the importance of plot to player enjoyment, then we might also ask ourselves, where does plot in a video game come from? The obvious answer is, of course, the source material. The game rightly can't have a very good plot if the player has to go out of their way reading online forums to make sense of what they just experienced. While I think this is certainly true of games by From Software such as Dark Souls or Bloodborne, I don't think this applies to Journey. Contrary to Kadikarus' claim that it gives him no reason to care about what is going on, I believe the context to the events of Journey is freely available to interpret from the source material itself, while the game is in motion. What makes Journey differ to Flower, its spiritual predecessor, is that the context behind the events of the game is more ambiguous. In Flower, there is a discernible tone with a clear message about protecting the environment and of nature overcoming mankind's global footprint. In Journey, there are a multitude of possible messages and ideas being conveyed, but these come from how the player interprets the stimuli of the game itself. It is no surprise, therefore, that a developer which openly prioritizes emotional engagement decided to make their game in this way. That being said, it would be foolish to deny that Journey lacks a plot at all. Journey has a clear objective of getting from point A to B, which the player can decide to follow or not. From the first few minutes of gameplay, the game introduces its world from a minimalist standpoint, makes the objective and control set known to the player without making them feel constrained, and all without uttering a single word. The lack of a HUD, save for a few faded button prompts, make it clear that an immersive experience has been prioritised, as well as the great attention to detail in the richly atmospheric environments. By relying solely on an aesthetic language to communicate to the player through animations, pictographs and sounds, Journey stresses a fascination with instinctive human interaction and communication, unconstrained by cultural conventions. Although quite taken for granted these days, our ability to communicate to each other is actually quite amazing and should be something to be celebrated. In this sense, I personally see Journey as nothing less than a celebration of wonder at our own human nature. Kadikarus argues that the plot of Journey offers nothing, specifically that the cutscenes give no backstory or progression, and that there is nothing cryptic or symbolic to chew on. I, for my part, couldn't disagree more. While it is true that many of the cutscenes feature a similar animation sequence between the player's character and a seemingly benign superior being, Kadikarus excludes to mention the pictograph tapestry sequences, which are also part of the cutscenes and actually do a great job of setting up the context to the events of Journey. It might take you one or more playthroughs to get used to the visual language of the game, but anyone with half a brain can interpret the lore of this world without having to go out of their way. From these sequences, as well as the little details and clues dotted around the game, many have inferred that the world used to be populated by a civilization of people who cultivated a form of energy which originates at the mountain. They harnessed this energy in the form of cloth, which allowed them to develop some type of technology, which is where these dragon-like creatures come from. At some point there was a schism within the civilization, which led to something of a war between two or more separate clans. Needless to say, this war ended tragically, leaving this strange race of people more or less extinct. From what is implied, it is the player's job to reach the source of the energy, but for an ambiguous motive. At this point, the plot transcends being bound to the source material and can be more or less whatever you want it to be. Perhaps you're seeking to rebuild the civilization somehow, or maybe you're seeking to become a benign superior being yourself. Needless to say, even with this taken into account, it doesn't mean that the story is any more or less appealing, but to deny its existence at all makes little to no sense to me, and seems dishonest, or at the very least lazy. When contemplating the gameplay, or content of Journey, Kadikarus likes to strip it down to its simplest definable components. For example, in a nutshell, Journey consists of walking, running, gliding, and sliding around, and is therefore not a very unique or interesting concept. In my opinion, stripping anything down to this bare-bones structural viewpoint can only be counterproductive. After all, what's a game like Tekken or DMC but hitting stuff, and what's a game like Heavy Rain but a QTE fest? Journey may also be criticised for its length, but for a $15 game I can say without a single doubt that the minimum of 2 hours of gameplay you get here is well worth the money. Some, such as Caddy, may accuse the game of feeling too rushed, that it merely starts and then ends, with no real variety or progression. However, time may well be spent making a connection with other players or drinking in the visuals. Progression can be made across multiple playthroughs, as new details can reassemble a player's subjective interpretation of what it's all about. And as for variety, the diverse environments and situations available in the game can evoke a profound range of emotions, ranging from a sense of exploration and wonder to suspense, fear, and excitement. How the game gets the player to feel all these emotions falls largely under execution, and I can confidently say that this game is pretty much executed flawlessly. Throughout Journey, the gameplay shifts tonally, with variations in movements and depiction of character to create a desired effect. Not to mention, visual and musical cues merge with one another seamlessly, often resulting in extraordinarily well-directed set pieces. As Matthew Matosis observes, it's not supposed to feel good to watch your player struggle uphill in the snow and slowly die of exhaustion and cold. We know this because the game deliberately constrains the controls for that particular effect. What makes the climax immediately following this moment effective then is the beautiful reversal, as the player is rewarded with even more freedom of movement than ever before. In this sense, a range of events or narrative occurs within the gameplay itself, an arc, which ultimately comes full circle, reaffirming the title's status as an emotionally engaging video game. In fact, Journey is so comfortable with its status as a game that it takes the cyclical nature of playing a game and incorporates it into the world. Despite all this, there's not much I can say to deter people from complaining that there isn't enough to do in Journey, apart from that I think there is something inherently honest about its self-presentation which defends it from this particular type of criticism. At the end of the day, the game is about a journey. Anyone expecting anything else is bound to be disappointed. Like an actual journey, the objective of the game is unwavering and linear. Although linear, the level design never makes the player feel constrained by the sections which piece it together. From the presentation, we can believe that there is a wider world out there, but is inaccessible due to a sandstorm or the immediacy of our goal. Some of the environments, for example, are exceptionally vast and can take up to long periods of time to navigate, capturing a very real experience of wandering through a barren desert. In this sense, Journey can take as long as you want it to, and can mean just about whatever you want it to as well. Following from this, I'd like to talk about something Kadika has said about not knowing what the game wanted him to feel. This was particularly surprising to me, as I believe that genuine feelings are evoked spontaneously and naturally as a reaction to stimuli, rather than something delegated or explicitly suggested by the source material. Surely your ability to care or feel something about a game has also got to come from yourself. The game can't feel it for you, and you shouldn't have to be told exactly how to feel about a piece of art anyway. If anything, this notion of expecting the game to tell you what to think and feel will only make it seem more obtuse and frustratingly vague. Perhaps if this notion was abandoned, then the game could potentially mean something new to you every time. It might represent something of personal significance to you, or even make you think about your life and what it means to be human. So to sum up, the game gives you nothing. Apart from unique aesthetic storytelling which transcends all cultural and communication barriers, an immersive, atmospherically rich world which is impeccably detailed and well designed, and an online experience unlike anything seen before. There's something about hearing these criticisms which makes me question, if the game is truly contextually and substantially empty, then where else do these aforementioned interpretations come from? As previously mentioned, the game can deliver a multitude of possible messages, concepts, emotions, and ideas via the interpretation of the player. For example, certain situations can be especially unique. The experience does not have to be the same for everyone just because the same key events happen between them. Instead, Journey gives the player a framework to create their own story, which is satisfying for its simplicity and purity. Playing the game online might reinforce this concept most. Upon becoming separated from a player, for instance, you might decide to stay behind and wait to see if they'll catch up with you, much like you might do if you were actually travelling with someone in real life. It's small occasions such as this which become part of your subjective experience, which will presumably shape your interpretation and level of enjoyment taken from the game. As Matthew Matosis notes, the experience of waiting and moving on may well pull you into your own little story about loss. Similarly, playing the game without bumping into someone could very well make you feel about loneliness and isolation. In turn, playing the game from start to finish with a partner might make you think about lifelong relationships. Maybe playing the game a second time could prompt you to think about someone else's life. Furthermore, even spiritual concepts such as reincarnation and apotheosis can all be taken from the experience too, and all without the game having to tell you specifically about what you're meant to be feeling. It is this lack of explicit context which definitively makes the game stand out. Human interactions between players within the game will vary from playthrough to playthrough, but are for the most part an enjoyable and unique experience. So instead of online encounters being merely two people who happen to be playing the same part of the game, they could just as easily be seen as a fascinating example of human coordination, in spite of any differences in age, gender, ethnicity, etc. In this way, Journey can enlighten our wonder at ourselves as human beings, perhaps reinforcing that deep down, we are all the same. Thank you for watching this video discussion on Journey. If you would like to see the ideas and counter-arguments presented in this video in more context, I'd like to direct you to the individual channels of Kadikarus and Matthew Matosis and to watch their videos on Journey. Both links will be in the description. In the meantime, I'd also like to point out that I have a 3-part video series on my main channel which breaks down 3 separate concepts a successful game is bound to have. Please also find these videos on difficulty, fulfillment and immersion in the video's description, and I do hope you enjoy them as well. Until next time, my name is Rocco Alexander Memory, and I am not a witch.
Bah.